Hello and welcome to the NewsX Sunday Guardian Roundtable. Well, today we're going to be discussing COVID solutions. We are here with the second surge, which is affecting the entire country. We are going into various states of lockdown. But in the end, what are the solutions? What can be done? In fact, there's a reason why we haven't got any BJP person here because I don't want it to be mudslinging of, one blaming the other or a political conversation. This is really, I think, we have to go beyond politics. If the politicians, the show will pardon this, and go have a actual discussion, non-partisan. But really, let's try and find out solutions, and also the larger impact on the economy, on also on our lives in general. What does this mean? This, because we thought we just got out of it, but no, we're back in it, and we may be stuck in this for a while more. So, how do we deal with it? What are the really easy solutions, out of the box solutions that we can really come up with? Joining me for this discussion is Milind Deora, ex-MP Congress, and also former UPA minister, Kalikesh Singh Deo, former BJD MP, and of course Dilip Cherian, image guru and political commentator. Milind, you're there in South Mumbai, really on ground zero, I would say. Just, if, what have you been seeing in terms of COVID management? What do you think really needs to be done? What is something that is good that is being done? Really your take on this.
Well, firstly, I would say that for Mumbai, for Maharashtra, for India, and really for the world, I think one thing that has to settle in is that this pandemic is here to stay and it's not going anywhere anytime soon. When the announcement of vaccines came about globally, people had a huge sort of sigh of relief, thinking that the pandemic will be over shortly. Now, what is very, very clear is that, and there's data in India to some extent. In a country like America, I spoke to a senior virologist just recently in the United States, and people are still unclear as to whether the vaccines that are available today in India and around the world can prevent somebody from getting COVID, and if they do contract the virus and the disease, from the kind of immunity that it would give them against these new mutant strains. So, what is very clear is that if it took almost 60 years for the Spanish flu to down mutate into influenza or a common cold, it will probably take a few years, if not longer, for coronavirus to down mutate into something which is very easy to manage, perhaps even just a chronic illness that somebody can easily deal with. Till such time, there are going to be many mutations, there are going to be many variants coming from different parts of the world, from different regions of different countries. And what that really means is that this virus and this pandemic is here to stay. That's the bad news. And that means we will all have to mask up, we will have to practice some form of physical social distancing. So, how do we respond to that is something which I think is very important for policymakers, for governments, certainly for citizens. I think today in India, without blaming anyone, I think the country collectively, and I say that the state, which means state governments, local governments, the central government, and you and I, the average citizen, we all thought that this, or we all hoped and prayed that this pandemic is behind us once we've been vaccinated. It will go away and we can get back to living a normal life. But I think where people made fatal errors, and I think the government of India made a fatal error in not vaccinating Indians as quickly as possible. They delayed the process. They had this vaccine diplomacy program, which, as I had once said, it brings us good karma internationally, but it unfortunately left our own citizens vulnerable. Secondly, I think states and municipalities, the capacity that they upgraded after the first wave, and I can certainly say that about Mumbai and Maharashtra. I had, for instance, pitched in, and with the private sector companies like Godrej and others, we built almost 1,000 beds, oxygenated beds in Mumbai, COVID care centers. We handed over several auto rickshaws which were fitted with testing equipment, which could dispense oxygen, go into slums and different pockets which are hard to get to. Unfortunately, a lot of that infrastructure has been pulled down and has been discarded by the municipality, state governments. I think where states have made a fatal error is that the infrastructure that was upgraded for the first wave was pulled down, done away with, and as a result, you need to have longer lockdowns in order to rebuild that infrastructure. And that, as you mentioned earlier, is hurting, if not devastating, our economy. I think the third error that we all made was you and I, the citizen, we became too complacent and we thought, let's remove our masks, let's meet people, let's travel, things are back to normal. And when this new mutant variant hit the country, um, younger people who had COVID before were getting infected. So this is unfortunate what is happening to India. I'm sure we'll get over it, but there will be a lot of devastation caused by this second wave. We'll have to figure out what we need to do with the economy. And we certainly cannot allow our guard to come down for a few years at the very least.
Next few years, Kalikesh, we're going to be like this. But, your first take on the current scenario, how have you been handling it?
I think, the first time round, even though the government of India official estimates were maybe around 1 crore people, I think they were mentioning that who got hit by COVID. I actually think a lot more actually did get hit. At that time, we weren't testing enough. Now, the second wave round, the reports are much higher of people being affected, but that's also because testing is also higher now. So I think between the wave last time and the wave this time, a large number of our citizens will be affected by COVID, and hopefully there will be some move towards some sense of herd immunity coming up along with the vaccination program. Yes, of course, vaccination doesn't prevent COVID, but they say it lessens the impact of COVID, even if it is the mutated or mutants or double mutants or even now the triple mutants that they talk about. The worrying thing for me is that the Indian government, and along with that, pretty much all the state governments, have had such short memories of the previous year's pains, trials, and tribulations that they really haven't managed to carry on any of that learning into the experiences that you're going today. I mean, it's really become like starting afresh from where we were, back in March 2020 when the hard lockdown was announced by the government of India all of a sudden. And now we find that even in the state of Odisha, there's weekend lockdown or weekend curfews to some extent. Many cities in northern India and western India are going into limited lockdowns, or they're calling it curfews, they're calling it shutdowns. But in reality, it really is a lockdown. Nobody's allowed in the streets, and if you are on the streets, you're subject to a lot of questioning. So this will have an impact. Yes, hopefully it will lessen the burden on India's healthcare system. And let me repeat that, despite last year's issues, there hasn't been as much thrust on improving capacity in the healthcare situation, even if it's just beds and oxygen, etc., etc. I know Milind talked about what he's done in a local manner, but really the thrust for the whole of the last financial year should have been that. And all this while we've had 3-4 elections in between, and healthcare has never been foremost either on an electoral promise nor as a reaction to the pandemic. Even now, the basic political debate in the country revolves around divisive issues such as Hindu, Muslim, Kumbh Mela versus Ramzan or Tabligis. I mean, we still haven't learned our lessons from the pandemic. But as I said, I'm a little more hopeful. I think next year we will see a much better situation. Hopefully India will come out of it. And hopefully with the new decision taken by the government of India, where they've allowed larger vaccination, maybe even supporting some of the vaccine makers to increase capacity, there will be some tempering down of the COVID situation. But the economic fallout for us will be there. I think 2021 will be as bad as 2020. And I think the next few years, we will feel the impact of the squeezing of the Indian economy.
Priya, just a second. I would agree with Kalikesh. I'm also optimistic. I do think that the government of India, state governments now know how to enforce a lockdown quickly and how to get faster results from a lockdown. I'm just trying to make the point that it's going to take some time before this pandemic completely disappears from the face of the earth. That's what is very clear. There are going to be new variants. So my point is that after the second wave is over, it's very important that the central government, state governments, and citizens don't let their guard down. and that the infrastructure that they built and created or rebuilt and recreated during the second wave should not be pulled down for when a third wave happens and you need another lockdown.
I think that's a good note of caution, if not a note of pessimism from Milind. And we don't want to have the same conversation next year also, Dilip. So yes, as Kalike said, government has taken steps. I would say too late, but at least some steps have been taken in the right direction. But having said that, what is your take of the current situation?
For complex problems, simple solutions are often the best solution. What is a simple solution that we are staring at? The country needs now, in the second phase of COVID, to recognize that you will have to have one more vaccination next year. And you should actually be getting your scientists to prepare a new set of vaccines and starting to talk about that. Because there is no doubt that this variant is not actually completely effective against these vaccines, is not completely foolproof against variant 2 or 3 or whatever you may call it. That's one. So the simple thing is start preparing for your next round of vaccinations, wherever those vaccines come from. We should now stop worrying about Atmanirbhar vaccine and worry about getting the best vaccine for your buck. That's one. The second thing is that I think Maharashtra has announced that it will have some kind of a food safety net for people who need to survive during the lockdown. I think that is an example which other states will have to follow. The simple solution number 3 is that the center must recognize that it alone has the funds to tackle this. It has very conveniently now said that state governments can access vaccines now that we opened it up to the age of 18, etc., etc. But I think that there is a bit of a passing the buck process going on. And the simple solution is to see who has the money. And Kalikesh mentioned this, that the money should have been the focus of this budget and of every exercise that happens thereafter, and not something else. I tend to follow what Milind said about a slowly petering off virus, but I also believe that it will take several years. In image terms, India has taken a hit because though the virus began from Wuhan, there is no talk of a Wuhan variant, but there is talk of an Indian variant, an Argentinian variant, a South African variant, and a British variant. I think India has lost out somewhat, and I think that we will definitely be at the brunt of global anxiety when this variant becomes global, and there's no stopping that. The fifth thing that I'd say is that if there is an economic slowdown, there are straightforward things that any country has to do to try and reflate its economy. And I don't see this being a priority. I think that we need to have two things. One, actual action, and two, a person who can actually talk up the economy. I'm not saying that just with fake promises, but with real interpretative solutions that allow companies, corporations to function better. All of it cannot be charity. There has to be a means by which you can give them support so that they can begin to get back to business, which is very difficult in these times and not going to get any easier.
We're here discussing, the second surge, how do we handle it, and also what is ahead of us. Milind, the economy is something you and I have had many conversations about, and I don't, it's just going to get worse and worse considering the situation we're in. Or do you see a ray of hope somewhere? Is there a way out? How do we fix the situation?
I would say on the economic front, the Indian economy has certainly bounced back faster than every industry expert predicted. If you talk to the real estate sector, they were expecting complete decimation. It bounced back very, very quickly. Almost every industry is already experiencing growth from the base of pre-COVID levels, which is a very encouraging sign. There's one industry which is really in acute distress and is a huge employer. It's a very local employer and a local contributor to GDP. It's the hospitality sector. When I say hospitality, I mean restaurants, I mean hotels, I mean eateries, cinema halls, entertainment zones. All of these are very, very adversely affected because these are all about an experience where people have to physically go out and get that service. That industry, and if you extend it to aviation and you look at it as a tourism and hospitality sector, that is certainly one sector which needs great assistance. If you look at the rural economy in India, it's actually doing very well, and it was an outlier in that it did exceedingly well last year when every other sector, manufacturing, services, did very poorly. As I said, a huge employer, huge contributor to GDP like real estate, at least residential real estate has come back, is much stronger than it was before. What will happen with a sector like commercial real estate, again, remains to be seen. But when you look at hospitality, you even cover the retail segment of real estate, of real estate. You cover, as I said, entertainment, eateries. That is a sector which needs financial assistance. That is a sector where much of the world, the developed and developing world, whether it's state governments or federal governments, have provided a lot of central assistance to. In the UK, the central government gave a lot of assistance to eateries. Today, in a small country like Singapore, where they've pretty much shut down tourism completely, even if you are a Singapore citizen and you travel abroad, you're not able to come back. And even for Singapore, today, malls, eateries are managing to survive and stay afloat because they're receiving government financial assistance. So I think that's very, very critical for India.
Kalikesh, you talked about our budget, what all left out. They were, apart from healthcare, private industry, or promoting various sectors that have been hit by the COVID have also been neglected, right?
See, Priya, I'm not as optimistic about the economy as maybe Milind is. Here's where I differ with him.
You're not as pessimistic in some areas and not as optimistic in some
he's
areas.
not so pessimistic about the health, but not so optimistic about the economy.
I'm more balanced.
Let the viewers decide that.
It comes down to being balanced. Yeah, it's the same thing.
Here's where I'm coming from as far as the Indian economy is concerned. I think the Indian economy has been showing signs of a steady decline. It's not after Modi came across or the pandemic struck. I think it's been happening since 2008, 2009, after the great boom bust situation. We've had some great run between 2002 and 2008, and then we've been going into a bit of contraction. Sometimes the data reflected it, sometimes it didn't. But honestly, what's happened now, as a result of the last 10 years, and again, I repeat, I'm not just blaming the Modi government, I'm also blaming the government before that to some extent, is that because of the liquidity which was given in those initial years of the boom years, what happened was that such a huge capacity in many industries got created that in the last 8 or 10 years, the capital formation or the investment which is required from private sector has just not gone through. And when you talk about gross capital formation or something like that, the private sector has been missing from any major investments in the economy in the last 10 years. If you speak to any big business home, and I think Milind would know a lot of them because they're all based around the Bombay area, they all complain about lack of demand. They all complain about not having excess capacity, not needing to invest. And then that sort of branches out into other things as the taxman chasing you and regulations not being in place, reforms not having been taken place to increase the demand or to increase exports. So I think we are caught in a bit of a catch-22 at this point of time. Because of as a response to the pandemic, the government of India did infuse a lot of liquidity, which is why you've seen a reasonable sharp recovery in the economy in the last 6 or 8 months. Stock markets have gone up. Some of these sectors have started manufacturing because they've got available credit. There's some latent demand they've managed to carry forward, especially in the auto sector, which was shut down for 3 or 4 months, and other sectors such as that. But as things progress and as inflation becomes an issue from a macroeconomic perspective, the government of India will start tightening down its interest rates. And the impact will be felt in sectors like residential housing and some of the sectors that Milind was talking about, the commercial sectors, the retail sectors, consumer goods, etc., etc. Number two, what's going to happen is because the private sector is still not willing to invest, the government will need to make massive investments. Now, if you were to talk to an economist in this current situation, the economist would have said, give a lot of tax break to industries, allow them to invest, allow them to claim larger depreciation of the capital formation that they actually incur. But because the government needs to invest and this government especially so, has a fairly large welfare program and even a larger propaganda and marketing program, they need money. So you find the tax guys going after anybody who can actually who figures as a tax-paying person or a body or an institution. So as a result of which the liquidity crunch held by individuals seems to have been exacerbated, and you find large corporations, some public sector units, and some bodies which already have enough money and don't really need the money are getting flushed with liquidity. I'll give you a small indicator of this. If you look at, not just in India, globally, if you look at stats, you'll find that the inequality between incomes in the last 1 year has dramatically increased. Those who are very rich have become richer. Far more billionaires have been created in the last year and a half during the pandemic, whereas the average per capita income of people or the standard of living has actually gone down across the world. So the poor have been adversely affected, whereas the rich somehow have benefited most from the efforts of the government. Number two, unless the government figures out a way to control macroeconomic factors and has a measured way of looking at this crisis over the next 5 or 7 or 8 years, it's not going to be able to give the correct inputs into the economy to make sure that we get out of it. And I fear this government doesn't have the capacity or the patience to look that far. It's going to be looking at elections which it fights with vigor every year, and it's going to be looking at 2024. So there are going to be a lot of large, welfare schemes being announced, which may or may not be funded. Lots of freebies being announced, which the government will struggle to fund, and they will become harsher on taxes. They will try and collect money from here and there, and that's going to have an even more adverse impact on private industry and private economy. So I really struggle to see where the Indian economy will take us, and partly is the fault of the government, partly is the fault of the pandemic and the response the government has to the pandemic. But it is a catch-22, and it's been coming to us for some time now. So we really need some measured thinking about the economy. It cannot be shooting off the hips in a cowboy Western style mode.
You were not joking when you said you were being pessimistic, but is he being realistic, Dilip?
I think he is. There are two things we need to take into account right away. One, we've all talked about the fact that the agriculture sector has been doing reasonably well. That is where the majority of our people are. So there is no doubt that a lot of the welfare schemes that are being touted now, while I'm all for it, and I agree that the poor need support, and I take the point that, we have had growth inequality growing during the pandemic year. The fact is that large sections of our population are fortunately at the moment out of the organized sector. Providing them with doles and fillets is great. It gives them hope, livelihood, and it's actually being done for purely political ends. So if you remove that as a factor of government spending, it would make great sense for government to not expand that, to keep it where it is, to make sure that that continues, but to try and give the kind of support that industry is looking for. Second, industry in India needs to look at industry 3.0. We are still looking at industry 2.0. If, for example, our drone industry or our crypto industry or a variety of industries were to be actually allowed to flower instead of being regulated to death, you have a chance that India will have some slice of the global pie as we come out of this. When we come out of this, industry across the world would have reinvented itself. The other day I was speaking to one of the world's largest private equity people, and he said that if industry does not use the opportunity that COVID provided and everybody goes back to business as normal, including sections of the hospitality industry, you will have a situation where you will actually get wiped out by something other than COVID, which is a global industry which has moved streets ahead of where Indian industry is. Indian industry is in version 1.0. The world is moving to 3.0. Does this government have the ability to plan for that and to encourage companies who have the ability to get there? We are talking about the possibility of introducing, 5G. We should actually be talking about companies in India in the defense sector, small and medium companies who are talking about 6G technology. But no, we refuse to talk about any of that. We will not discuss the elephant in the room. And I think it's time that economists and the government understand that when the world emerges from COVID, it's going to be a new world, and Indian industry will not be able to cope. Indian people, because they are poor, may be able to cope, and no amount of gold will help.
Okay. On that note, Milind, do you want to add anything as the last word? Or your...
No, I would agree with both the points that Kalikesh and Dilip made. I think that the Indian economy and the world economy is obviously reeling from low investments after the financial crisis in 2008. But I personally believe that if India does and effectively implements what has been announced in the budget and does something similar to what Joe Biden is doing in the United States right now, which is to invest heavily in infrastructure, you have a huge trickle-down effect. It affects ancillary industries. It can restart the entire investment cycle in the country. And I would be a little more optimistic about our economy in spite of other problems that exist in our country, that exist all over the world, frankly. They exist in the United States, whether it's inequalities or other issues. As far as, thinking completely out of the box, like Dilip mentioned, what should India's strategy be, let's say, on a digital currency, cryptocurrency? I think these are things we have to be, with great respect, we have to sort of be aware of our limitations as a country. Today, for instance, there is a war between China and the United States in the area of space technology, in the area of digital currencies, cryptocurrencies, in the area of robotics, in the area of artificial intelligence, in the area of drones, in the area of driverless cars. All of these areas are areas where, frankly, India doesn't even have 0.1% market share. Or, unfortunately, we don't even have the innovative capabilities because we don't have an evolved private sector that the United States does. And neither do we have undemocratic, we can argue how democratic or undemocratic our government is, but an autocratic communist system in the way that China does, where the state comes in and says, I'm doing this, to hell with anyone, whether you like it or not, to hell with a farmer, whether I'm taking your land and you're happy about it or not. So we're somewhere in between the two countries. That's our financial, economic ideology and model. And we have to function within those. But I would agree that COVID does present an opportunity to every country, and certainly a large economy like India, to think out of the box. And perhaps there are some sectors, perhaps defense is a good area where we can reduce our dependence on foreign imports, and we can create a strong indigenous industry like we have in vaccines, which can not just cater to domestic demand, but also become a global exporter. So those are areas where I would agree that the government and the private sector should think out of the box.
On that note, thank you all for this conversation. And I must say, it's very refreshing to have a conversation where, we actually made some very sound points without really getting into pot shots and politics, apart from the optimistic and pessimism point of view. But thank you all of you for this conversation.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.